Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. What an honor it is today to welcome Dr. Lerone A. Martin as our guest on Conversing. Dr. Martin is the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor in Religious Studies and Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute, both at Stanford University. He is an internationally recognized and award-winning author and public speaker. One of his earlier books that has been greatly shaping to me is his book called The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover. But today we have the opportunity to have him as our guest to discuss a new book that's just coming out called Young King, an opportunity to look at the very early life and development of Martin Luther King Jr. as a young child and an emerging young adult, all the way through his marriage to Coretta King. Dr. Lerone Martin, thank you so much for being a guest on Conversing today.
It's an honor and a privilege to be with you. Thank you for having me.
The role that you have at Stanford is something that I want to explore later in the time, but it sets you up for an opportunity to be able to pause and be a reflective leader of this moment that we're in right now culturally, which is another thing that we're going to come to. But the core of the conversation that I'd like to have today is really going to be focused on your recent book that's just about to come out entitled Young King. It's really a remarkable book. I have to say, having read other writings of yours, that you are a wonderful writer. And there's a kind of cleanness to your prose and your ideas and your way of telling narrative that don't feel in any way reductionist, but they make the story move along and they capture, I think, a reader's attention in a really strong way. I felt that very much in your earlier book, The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, and I feel it again in having read Young King. So thank you very much for the time and effort that you put into reading this. I hope many of the listeners that are tuning into this program will take advantage of that and pick up a copy soon.
Thank you.
Let's just jump into it. You know, you have this interesting background and your own personal formation, but I'd like people before getting into King to hear a little bit about what formed you, because really the book is about what was happening that formed MLK. So what were the things that formed you as a child?
Thank you for asking. The faith of my parents is probably first and foremost. My parents went to different churches. My mother was saved in the Pentecostal tradition. My father was raised in the Baptist tradition, Black Baptist tradition. And so my mother, I think it's safe to say, she felt that my father's Baptist faith didn't go far enough. She felt like it was staid and felt too formulaic. And my father, on the other end, felt my mother's Pentecostal faith went too far. I recall him saying more than on one occasion, it doesn't take all that. But what I took from both of them growing up is first my father's commitment to service. His Baptist faith, I think, really shaped him about doing things for others. And then what I took from my mother, I think, is really the importance of trying to cultivate a devotional life, a relationship with Christ. Took that from my mother. But also they formed me by their debates. I recall their debates on religion and politics, especially, it sticks out in my mind when I came of age in the 80s and 90s with the rise of the moral majority and Reagan and Bush, and my parents being at odds in many ways, and Clinton as well, about the role of morality, what is moral. My mother at the time would think about morality primarily around sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and my father was less concerned about that, but more concerned about economic justice and morality. So seeing them have these debates, I think really shaped me. And I thought that was very normal. I thought, don't all parents do this, right?
Right.
And
Right.
I think when I went off to college, I went to Anderson University. And I think being there is when I realized like, oh, well, this isn't always, civil, and this isn't always what people do. People kind of go to their corners and retreat to their corners. And so that really shaped me, thinking about the importance of being very deliberative and thoughtful about one's faith and the different traditions that help to form us. And that kind of brings me to today, how I'm thinking about trying to form my own children. And that's the personal reason, I think, for writing this book, is just thinking about, how to raise, children to have a moral compass, to be people of integrity, to recognize when they make mistakes and take accountability and responsibility. And I think all of that combined with the professional commitment to say that I felt that, as you just asked me this question about myself, what formed me, I felt that the scholarship on King had not gone far enough into that direction about what forms Martin Luther King Jr. And so that's the professional side of why I wanted to write this book.
So in your own narrative, what were the prompts then that sent you eventually to Princeton Theological Seminary? Were you exploring the possibility of professional ministry? Were you there
I was. I really went off to college, was in the religious studies major, and just thought for sure that I was going to be a pastor. And so had a great team at Anderson University, a number of professors there, Meryl Strege, David Sebastian, James Lewis, Sharon Pearson, the list goes on. And they helped me to decide, I was looking at a couple of different seminaries. I'll never forget Dean David Sebastian. He was dean of the School of Theology. He took me out to lunch. And it was at this restaurant where they had like the large paper that they would rip off and put as like the table cover. And he took a pencil and he sort of drew this theological spectrum for me and said like, what schools are you thinking about? And I told him. He said, okay, let me kind of show you on a kind of spectrum of left to right, conservative and liberal, where these schools land. It was so helpful to me. I don't know if he remembers that or not, but shout out to Dean David Sebastian if he hears
That's
this.
Great.
And so I applied to 3 schools in very different traditions, landed on Princeton Theological Seminary, started off there really thinking about being a pastor. It was during my second year of a wonderful field education experience at Church of the Redeemer Baptist Church in South Philadelphia, teaching Wednesday night Bible study, answering questions about different faiths, different traditions, different beliefs within Christianity and Islam. And that experience, I just fell in love with it, just teaching. And I knew then that in my second year, my MDiv, that I think this is actually what I want to do. I think I want to teach and have questions that are related to religion and politics, but also faith formation. And that led me to apply to PhD programs and eventually landed at Emory University and finished my PhD there.
Thank you for telling us a bit about the pieces that formed you. And that's a very interesting insight about what happens when you're in seminary thinking you're going to be a pastor and then can fine tune it really more in the teaching direction, which Princeton, of course, is wonderfully set up to help people go in that direction. And obviously the work at Emory that followed from that. What was it like, knowing this book is about King, what was it like to spend that time in Atlanta, and how did your own experience and maybe even understanding of King begin to develop further because you were in Atlanta?
It's a great question. My first encounter with him, I think scholarly, was actually an undergraduate. I took a class called African American Religious History taught by James Lewis. That was the first time I had encountered King in terms as a scholar, in a scholarly sense. And then at Princeton Seminary, Dr. Peter Paris taught a course on the theology and ethics of Martin Luther King Jr. And that was the first time I had sustained study. I got the books and tore through them. And that was like, whoa, this is all the stuff that I didn't know. And then moving from there to Atlanta, visiting the King family home, the King Center, really immersed me in it. And it's a very strange thing. It's almost like oxygen in the sense that like I immerse myself in it because you're in Atlanta, but then it almost becomes invisible because it's everywhere, but right? And it becomes just a part of Atlanta and a part of being in Atlanta. I think moving away and then doing this project on the FBI and then recognizing the FBI trying to use ministers to discredit Martin Luther King Jr., that forced me back into reading more about King and as a person. And I think that just, was trying to put myself in his shoes, like your own government is hunting you. And what that must have felt like and how that must have, how does one wake up in the morning and how does one move when one feels as if it's one's own government is after you? And that personalized King for me. And then also as I became a father, also just thinking about my own kids, and at one point in time, King was a kid, right? And who would never have thought perhaps that he would be under the microscope that he was and remains. So I think that Atlanta shaped me in the sense of forcing me to kind of reintroduce myself to King, apart from the icon, but as actually the person.
Well, I have to say, I feel like I've read quite a lot about King, and yet his childhood in the way that you describe and young adult formation is something that I've never really understood nearly as much about as your book provides the opportunity to do. And I found myself full of shock moments where it was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that was the case, or that I'd heard a piece of something, but I had no context. So it felt to me like it filled in lots of empty space that was certainly true for me. And because it's such a readable, beautifully written book, and because your capacity for narration is really strong, it reads really, really well and draws you, I think, into a story that is not a simple story, and it's not a unidirectional story. It has all kinds of various wrestlings that you would expect, partly because that's true of every human story, but it is certainly true of his story. And the way that you narrate that is really quite a profound experience, and was very, very moving at a number of points for me. I wonder, for starters, let's just say all the things that King has in common. I mean, he's a kid, so 1,000 things that every kid in their own version experiences, he experienced. What was it about that part of his narrative that drew your attention then?
Oh man, what drew my attention, I think, is the normal things you say, like playing with toys. His sister, as I relay this in the book, tells a story that, like she was the older sister. They were only about a year apart. And, he was a terror at times to her. She says, you recall in the book, she says that King and his younger brother, who was only a year younger than King, used to take her Barbie dolls and dismember them and then hide the pieces of the Barbie dolls in various points of the house and force her to find them. So just that, because I'm a little brother, I have 4 older siblings. Right. And so that drew me to him, because I remember just like, oh God, I probably was really annoying to my older siblings, and realizing how frustrating that was for them. And his sister says, she recounts the story and says flat out, they were bullheaded boys, that drew me to him. But also what drew me to him, and I know this from my parents and from my older siblings, his incessant curiosity.
Yes, amazing.
And I shared that as a child as well. I many of times got told to be quiet because I would always be asking questions about movies or the news and current events. And my father was adamant about us reading the newspaper. And so that also drew me to him, this curious little child who's, the story I tell, a librarian retells a story of him coming into the Auburn Avenue Library and always trying out what he considered big words on her. He wanted to show off that he knew words like particularly or other big words or poems. And so I think, just trying to, that drew me to him because I recall my older sister, I have an older sister, Nicole, who's 10 years older than me. And I recall when her friends would come over the house, always trying to have conversations with them and wanting to show, although they were 16 and I was 6,
right.
that I could hold a conversation with adults, and all of that drew me to him, and I related to it because I similarly was a curious child.
Yes. One of the things that struck me is that he, from a very young age, had a self-consciousness that I think often doesn't develop for many people until they're at least 5 or 6 or maybe even 10 years older than he was. He had a self-consciousness, as you explain it, about speech, like you just exemplified, a self-consciousness about his appearance in a really positive, affirming way, but that affected his dress and many other things about how he ordered his life. He had a self-consciousness about voice as well, by which I mean both his literal voice and his wider sense of voice, his presence and persona. Just share a little bit about that part of his, I think, early development, precocious in these ways.
Yes, I think part of this is both beautiful and tragic in that I think it's beautiful in what you articulated. I think the tragedy is some of this is forced upon him, I think, because of experiencing racism at such an early age that makes him conscious, as he says in his own words, about what being Black and what that meant in America, right? So the story is simply that he has these 2 friends. He plays with white children and everything is great. And they are great friends. They wrestle, they play basketball, they do what kids do. And then at the age of 6, when it's time to go off to school, he recognizes they go to one school and he goes to another, and still after school wants to play with them, talk to them about what they did in school. And finally he's told by the white children's parents that they can no longer play together, right? Because of Martin's race. And that's tragic. And he says that he cried, right? He crawls into his mother's lap and cries about this. But the beautiful thing, as you just mentioned, is that his mother tells him a message that really sticks with him his entire life and is really core to his ministry. And that is that you are somebody, and that you're, in God's eyes, you're just as good as anybody else. And this thing that you're experiencing, as best as she could explain to a 6-year-old child, this thing called racism, the separate schools and separate drinking fountains, that's man-made. That's not what God intends. And to have that type of confidence as a young person, it does make him conscious of his self at an early age. But his parents, especially his mother, was so beautiful in making sure that consciousness was affirming, as you pointed out. And King says, throughout his life, in various points, he points out about how he had to tap into that somebodyness. He says, in short, when he's going to high school, when he has to ride the streetcar across town to the only high school in Atlanta that accepts African Americans, he has to see the sign every morning that says, colored in the back, white in the front. And he says he reminds himself, I kept my mind, he says, at the front of that streetcar. And I said to myself, one day I'm going to put my body where my mind is. And that comes from mom, right? That's a kind of internal struggle, psychological consciousness, as you pointed out, that he has to cultivate every single day. And that is what, by the time he shows up, I would, in the public square, when he shows up as a public figure, he's been cultivating that sense of somebodyness for a very long time. So I appreciate that question, because you're right. It's something that he has to cultivate for a very long time, and it's throughout his life, and it changes, but it's always core to who he is.
It's always there. That's the thing that is so striking to me. I think if I had guessed it, I would have said, well, developmentally, that's probably in your teenage years where you begin to do some of that assembling work. But as you say, because of that context of racism and Jim Crow in particular, that all of that necessity of battling against that with a different script, a different narrative, a different way of identifying himself and affirming who he is despite this counter pressure. Incredible. I want to come to the moment where he leaves the South, because that is really one of the high points to me in the book. But I want to go back to your own story. Did you have a narrative where you had to rehearse a script like that to claim and clarify your identity, or were circumstances enough different? Obviously, you experienced racism, I'm sure, but
wow, that's a great question. I do recall racial differences growing up, and I think the refrain that I hear in my mind's eye, right, is my mother telling me that I'm a child of God, and that you're going to try to make me cry here, and that I was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my mother did that because of her own Christian faith, but also because I was and I am her darkest child in terms of my skin complexion. And so I think my mother was cognizant of the world she was sending me out into. My mother is a lighter skinned than I am. So I think that was my mother's for me, that I was a child of God, which came with both privileges but also responsibility, right? That I was to conduct myself not just as Rose and Larry's baby, but I was to conduct myself as someone who was a child of God, and that I was beautiful. And I think that went beyond just being handsome, right? Beauty was like both external and internal. And so I think that was the refrain my mother often taught me. And then the other side of that, I think, and my mother and I have talked about this within the last year, now that I'm an adult. The other side of that I realized that I think she would do differently is that when I started being precocious and asking lots of questions in class, there were times where apparently I was bored and would then, like a lot of children, act out.
Right.
And apparently my mom and dad, and I loosely remember this, but my mom and dad were called to the school because I told a teacher that I was completely bored and she was boring. And I remember my parents arguing about this. I don't remember saying that to the teacher, but I remember my parents arguing about me saying it. And my father saying, "Have you ever stopped to think that maybe the boy is bored?"
Touche.
And my mother saying, "That's besides the point. Like, he has to learn to behave."
Yes.
And so I remember my mother coming to me, I remember this, saying, I understand that you may be bored in class, but you have to learn to respect authority, because when you become a man, the consequences are significantly higher for someone who looks like you. And I think I knew exactly now what she was trying to do. She was trying to protect me. And I think my father was more interested in, well, maybe we need to find a way to challenge him more. But I think my mother's protective nature kicked in and was thinking, that's besides the point. Just do the work you're supposed to do and stay out of trouble. And I think we've talked about that now that I'm an adult, and I think they would probably have handled it differently, But I do recall that moment too, my mother just being terrified of, of me being an adult man and not respecting authority and what could happen to me.
Right.
And
How
so,
do you think your mom would handle it differently in particular?
I think now she would probably say, number one, you can't say that sort of thing to people of authority. But two, let's interrogate that.
Yes.
Maybe you are bored. Maybe we need to move you to a different school. Maybe we need to think about you doing extra work outside of school. Maybe we need to supplement your learning. I think she would probably have done that differently now, right? But hindsight is 20/20, right? But
One day when I was serving at Fuller, there was a Black student that I was particularly close to, and he was and is just a remarkable person for 1,000 different reasons. And at the moment that I'm remembering, he was really engaged in some very deep and significant work related to race. And I was watching him articulate this and thinking about how wonderfully and strongly and passionately and beautifully he was expressing that. But what was happening inside as I was listening to this was thinking, and I know this is obviously a white statement, but I was so stunned in a way that even I, having had lots of friends of color over my life, I was so stunned by the fact that his life had to be defined by working his way out of this box that society and culture had placed him in. And I kept thinking, what else would his magnificent gifts be able to be given to if he did not have to be given to this particular battle? And I think it changed. I think that moment changed me in many ways as a part of a long arc of being changed. But I think it also means that when I read a book like Young King, and I'm thinking, here is this person who shows all kinds of unbelievable giftedness very early in his life, despite his, wrestlings and challenges and usual developments and particular developments, that so much of the gauntlet that had been thrown down by racism was going to affect his whole life. Now, everybody has something that's thrown down at their feet, but in this case, it's highly personal and it's social and it's aggressive and it's life-threatening in many contexts, not least when and where he was growing up. So I asked these questions not to be invasive into your life, but to just still wanting to articulate and understand more what that is. I mean, the fact that you're in this particular position at Stanford feels so, unbelievably fitting for 1,000 reasons in terms of just your inherent credentials and abilities and so forth. But it's also like a mantle that you have taken up as an act of your own createdness, your own beauty, your own seriousness in the ongoing work. And I just wanted to pause and say how much I honor that and how I both celebrate that and in some way that I think is not sentimentalism, also grieve that in a certain way. I hope that makes sense.
No, it makes complete sense. And I want to thank you for saying that. You reminded me of Howard Thurman, the theologian, points this out in some ways in The Luminous Darkness, which is the luminous darkness, the anatomy of segregation. And he points out just what you stated about just the energy that people of color, in particular African Americans, during Jim Crow, he's talking about all the energy that is used just to kind of maintain a somebodyness. Like waking up and where you live is shaped by the color of your skin. The water fountains, the schools, like the built environment around you tells you are less than. And then you have to arrive and live in a world where you're constantly using up psychological energy to combat that and to affirm yourself and to affirm your loved ones and your fellows who share this plight. And he talks about this, that just takes up a lot of energy in people. And I think that could go to as you said, anyone who has their lives limited by, some type of identity placed upon them. It's literally limited. And you're right. It takes up a great deal of energy, not only to not succumb to it, but also to try to rise above it.
Yes.
Right.
Completely. Yeah. His years of development continue through, obviously, very young life, then grade school, junior high, and high school. We're in a minute going to come to his heading off to Morehouse College. But in that period, he continues to have all the developmental things that are true of children and adolescence and has a great eye for the girls and vice versa, and sports and this mindfulness of public presence and of being involved, being a person committed to the deep things. I guess that's one of the things that strikes me from this very early self-consciousness. I'm committed to the really deep things that are going on, not just, yes, to the entertainment value of all the things that he was clearly capable of winsome in doing, but also the deep work that was going on. That the beauty of that development is really captivating, and also very sad given the way that it's constantly being buffeted by Jim Crow realities.
Yes. I love the way you frame that. And that's what I try to say in the beginning, that he's extraordinary and ordinary and everything in between. And you're right, there is the kind of dandyism. He loves dressing up. He is a great dancer, apparently. He was amazing at doing the jitterbug. And his brother was envious of that because he was the best dancer and all the girls loved that. But at the same time, you're right, he's also, practicing speeches in the mirror. He's joining speech contests to try to be a recognized orator, writing for the high school newspaper, so he's about the race problem. So, he's, like you said, he's both every bit a teenager, but also concerned about the deep things. And I think it's a testament to mom and dad in the sense that they are people of service. And so while he wants to serve because that's just the way he's been raised, he's also a teenager, so he's resistant to serving in the same way mom and dad serve, right? He doesn't want to go into the ministry. He doesn't want to be involved in any of that. He thinks he wants to be respectable, and he thinks the respectable profession of being a lawyer is the way that he can really impact society. And that makes sense. He's dealing with Jim Crow laws. He thinks maybe he can, work to change these laws. And, he starts learning about Gandhi in high school. And, and Gandhi had been a lawyer, right? So I think all of this makes sense in why he says, okay, I'm going into law. And also, it fits well for someone to be in the law, to look good and to wear a nice suit.
Yes.
So all of that kind of comes together in the midst of being a teenager. And I think I wrote some of that thinking about my own teens, Mark, because not my own teenager, I should say. I have a teenager and a preteen, and just thinking of watching them, like at one moment do something and I'm like, yeah, these guys are growing up. They really get it. And, it could be the next 30 seconds later. It could be the next day. I'm like, what in the world were you thinking?
Right.
And I think that's what I tried to show in the book about King, that this is a very normal experience of being a teenager. There are these flashes of brilliance. And then there are these moments of like, you're every bit of 14, So you're right. He's both concerned about the sort of teenage things, but also the deeper things as well.
I want to touch on one more thing about his childhood, because it of course is not just a childhood issue. It extends through the rest of his life. But having a father that was as prominent as his dad, who was the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, definitely a man who knew his station, loved his station, wanted the best for his son to have a similar, if not the same, station, and had designs, a strong voice of authority against which King pushed, but also clearly was formed a lot by his father and by the strength of his dad. Just say a bit more about that relationship, because it's really so critical to the whole narrative.
Yes. The dad is this huge figure. I think King respects his father a great deal. He writes in one of his early seminary assignments at Crozier that his father was the quintessential provider. They never went without. They had everything they needed and much of what they wanted. But he also didn't want to be his dad. He doesn't want to be someone who preaches and climbs on top of the pews and sweats and hollers and screams. And he also doesn't like to fight. He has a period that I chronicle where he's angry about the death of his grandmother and angry about things around him that he does. get into fights and becomes violent. But for the most part, he doesn't really like to fight. And his father is a fighter. His father even says, King came along and Martin Luther King Jr. comes along, and he said, I really didn't know what to do because all the King men had tempers. And he says, King is just so sensitive, and I just don't know what to do with this kid. And King Jr. develops this sort of strategy of dealing with his dad that even Coretta, when they're dating, picks up on it. And he kind of appears to acquiesce to his father's wishes and commands. Yes, Dad. Okay. Yes, Dad. But then we'll go do what he wants to do. And that included marrying Coretta. They were not, the mom and dad, but especially Dad was not keen on him marrying Coretta. And so throughout King's life, especially as a teenager, he seemingly acquiesced to his father and then will go do what he wants to do. That includes things like dancing. You know, they're Baptists in the South. They don't believe in dancing, but King will sneak off and go to dances for the YMCA.
And Jitterbug.
And Jitterbug, that's right. And Jitterbug the night away. And when he's in college, will host these sort of dance parties when his parents are gone off, you know, doing ministry, work for the ministry. So he respects his father, but he still has the streak in him where wants to be his own man and wants to do what he wants to do.
Yes.
And that's a lot of teenagers, you know, right?
Absolutely. Totally. Yeah. So after some agony on King's part, he is uncertain where he wants to go to school, but then eventually decides that he wants to go to Morehouse. And I think one of the most powerful parts of the book for me is the way that you narrate the literal and physical process of moving from home north to Connecticut and then comes back to Morehouse. And I wonder if you could just summarize that, because it's such a powerful experience in King's life. Unbelievable. And it's so, the force of that emotionally, I think you just capture with tremendous skill. So tell people who haven't yet read the book what that is about.
Yeah. I really think that when King is 15 years old, he goes off to Connecticut. And I think this is really where he experiences his calling to the ministry. King will say himself, his call to the ministry was not like what you see in the Bible. It wasn't, no flashing lights, no talking animals, no angel from heaven. But really, he counts his time in Connecticut as the time where he starts to feel called. So he applies to go to Morehouse. Morehouse has a program to send young men to Connecticut to pick shade tobacco to make money for tuition. King goes, he's one of the youngest guys there. He's 15 years old. And he writes a couple letters home that we have here at the King Institute, and we've published in the King papers, where he is just at 15, he's fascinated at what he's seeing. It's his first time leaving the segregated South. And he writes a letter home by saying, once the train arrives in Washington, D.C., there's no more racial segregation. It's the first time he's ever lived in a world where there's no Jim Crow signs. And he's rode on the train all the way from Atlanta to DC in the Jim Crow car, where it's dilapidated, it's hot, doesn't have any of the amenities as the rest of the train does, and then gets to DC and is sprung free. And it writes home and says, I'm seeing things I thought someone of my race would have never seen before. And then when he gets to Connecticut, he's working and picking tobacco, which, by the way, all the people who were there with him said he was absolutely terrible at picking tobacco, that he just was lazy and too small and wasn't good. And he writes letters home like, Mom and Dad, you wouldn't believe it. I went to a white church today. I went to a restaurant in Hartford, the finest restaurant in Hartford, and I sat where I wanted to sit. I went to the movies and I didn't have to sit in the balcony. And he's just floored about this world that he's experiencing for the first time at 15. And friends who are there with him say that he starts to say, like, this is God's country. Like, this is this is how life was meant to be lived. And I want to know why my friends back home in Atlanta can't live like this. And he's just floored by that. Now, he'll later discover that Connecticut wasn't perfect, that it had its own racism, but for him at the time, it's just an amazing experience. And probably the most formative experience, in addition to what he saw, was preaching for the first time. He is invited for some reason, we don't know why, but the older men say, you know, you're going to lead our religious services every Sunday morning. It may be because his dad was a pastor, or maybe because like we got to put this kid to work doing something because he's terrible at picking tobacco. He works in the kitchen and he writes home, I'm leading the religion department is what he tells his parents, you know, to sound really important. But what it really is, he's just leading devotionals and preaching every Sunday in the dorm. And that's the first time that we know in history that King actually preaches. And we don't know exactly what he said, but those who were there say that the sermons were all about service and all about helping people. And he develops his voice there. He develops his voice there, and he develops this desire to preach. And comes back home, changed. His parents say that he's just talking constantly about the North and what he experienced and how it changed him. His sister says he seems to have matured and left a boy and came back a man. He starts college really early at 15. And his friends say that's all he can talk about is like, I had this experience, but I don't want to be a minister. I don't want to be a minister. I don't want to be a minister. And all of them to get to the point where they say he talks about it so much they start to avoid him because they're like, oh, he wants to talk. We want to talk about girls and school and music, the latest song by Nat King Cole. And this guy just keeps saying he wants us to convince him why he shouldn't go in the ministry. And then one of his friends, William Pickens, says, but all of us had saw what happened in Connecticut and we were all clear. The ministry was where he needed to be and where he was called to be. But his first 2 years of college, he wrestles with that. And from majors in sociology, refuses to do anything in theology. But then like a lot of us, his junior year takes a class with a professor and it changes his life. Takes a class called Intro to the Bible with Professor George Kelsey. It's the only class he received an A. And King says that class changed his life. It showed him that, you know, the Bible didn't have to be interpreted in a fundamentalist way. And he essentially learns the historical critical method about how to go behind the story and deeper into the text to pull out moral truths. And so now King feels as if the ministry is respectable. He has a professor who's got a PhD from Yale, so he's saying, and he has a president in Benjamin Elijah Mays who has a PhD from University of Chicago. These two men, he says, are so influential in helping him see a professional ministry. And from there, he starts telling his friends on campus, including William Pickens, and he's like, I've been called. I'm gonna join the ministry. And he joins the ministers' union on campus and really relaxes in a way. It's like, I've got my future figured out. I can relax a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
It's such a moving part of the book, I think, because you have told the story clearly, getting ready for this moment. And I haven't gone back and restudied the prose that you use, but somehow you've created a sense of the claustrophobia and the imprisonment, really, of Jim Crow. And then there's this train trip where it's almost rubbed in their noses by having to be in a Jim Crow car. And then this unbelievable freedom of getting off of the car in Washington, D.C., and then again in New York before getting to Connecticut. And this sense of liberty that's just flooding his lungs and his eyes and his imagination and his spirit. It's like it's like he just begins to take flight in a completely different way. And he had managed life in the cage, if you want to put it that way, but he'd also obviously been made for far more than the cage, as every
Yes.
human being has. And the way that unfolds gives me a great sense of the depth of the emotion, the long-term emotion that shaped so much of the rest of his fight for justice, because he himself had in his lungs, as it were, the fresh oxygen of something that he just hadn't experienced, believed was right, was true, was just, but had not yet been his own lived experience.
That's right.
It's really a high point in the book, and I think it sends us down the rest of the story that you cover in the book to experience him as a person whose horizon is now so much broader and deeper than it had been based on the circumstances. But he had always been fighting for it, believing that it was there. He just hadn't stepped through the door or off the train, as it were.
That's right.
So one of the things that happens after that is that there's the stories that you tell about his romantic relationships and ultimately his marriage to Coretta, which was obviously a very, very pivotal moment in his life. And then about his first call to Dexter Avenue Church. So tell us a little bit about, as we come toward the close of our times, a little bit about Coretta, their marriage and so forth. And then I want to have you comment on one part of the beginning of his time at Dexter.
Yeah. You know, everybody knows, I think, in life, one of the most important decisions you make is who you choose to partner with, right? And I wanted to include this in the book, especially for someone going into the ministry. And so I did my best to let Coretta's voice tell the story of their courtship and how they met. And Coretta is very honest in some recorded interviews that she is not attracted to him. She says that he pulls up, they meet, they're introduced over the phone. He pulls up in this green Chevy his father's bought him. And she says she's looking as he pulls up thinking, that car is small and he fits in that car way too well. So she says, I've always liked tall men, and here's this 5'7" guy. And, you know, he's got a kind of receding hairline. He's got these bigger ears. And she's like, I don't even know if I'm getting in the car. So she gets in the car. They drive to have their first date. And they're having lunch. King is working on his PhD. He's in his first year, second semester. She's at the New England Conservatory studying music and performance. And they have this date, and she says within the first 20 minutes, he starts to become handsome because they start talking about dismantling Jim Crow. And she's like, wow, this guy is not like any minister I've ever met. He actually believes in service. He actually is not selfish. He's smart, but he's, you know, really serious about service. And so she says he becomes handsome right before her eyes. And at the end of the date, he's, you know, clearly he's only, this is 1952. So King is only 23 years old. She's a year older than him. And he says, you have everything I've ever wanted in a wife. You've got character, beauty, intelligence, personality. When can I see you again? I think you this is perfect. And she tries to play it cool, you know, and she says, well, you know, you may call me. That's what she says, and exits the car. And they go back and forth through this. Right. They have this up and down where he's like, let's get married. But she's like, I'm not sure I want to give up my career. She had planned to travel the world and sing music and perform and use the arts to help to dismantle Jim Crow and bring about justice and equality. But she recognizes, and he's very honest with her, what he expects in a wife. He says women are capable of doing anything a man can do. However, in my situation, I expect when I get married that I will pastor a church. It may be a tiny church, but it's wherever God calls me, and I expect my wife to be at home. And so she wrestles with that. Not sure she wants to give up her life and her career, but then decides that she's falling in love with him, and decides through some ups and downs in their relationship, decides that she loves him and says that what better way could I serve than being a minister's wife? And once she finally tells him that, he then drives that little green Chevy from Atlanta from Boston to Atlanta during Christmas break to get his father's approval. And he convinces his father why he should not marry this other woman his father wants him to marry, named Juanita Sellers, who I chronicle in the book, and convinces his dad why Coretta's the one he should marry. And they get married in the summer of 1953 on the front lawn of her parents' house in Alabama. And then they decide to depart as he gets his first call to the ministry at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And that's where I end the book about this is where King starts off pastoring, and this is before the world knows who he is, really. And that's where I end the book with he and Coretta arriving in Dexter and getting ready to start their life together.
And what happens at that moment is that, of course, he has to preach his first sermon, and we would all say that one of the dominant themes of his teaching and speaking for the rest of his life is really about love.
Yes.
It's probably the single word that is most repeated over all of the other extraordinary images and powerful words that he declares. But love is certainly, I would say, the dominant word. And that's why I was stunned when you said that his first sermon was simply called Love Your Enemies.
Yeah.
That was a showstopper moment to me because it showed this incredible seriousness, the deep things, right? He was not going to start his pastoral ministry in the shallows. He was going to start at the deepest end. And the only way of explaining the totality of his life and his work was really because he was convinced that deep end was the main thing. And the gold standard in that way of what it is that God is trying to develop and nurture and redeem in the world. And so to think your first sermon is not something sweet and pleasant, but actually love your enemies is so telling about him and so revealing about his sense of mission and call, their togetherness in that work.
Yes.
And I think it just tees up, and then the rest unfolds from there. Like, of course it does. And to preach and teach loving your enemies and then to be killed by your enemy is just breathtaking. And I'm so glad that you shared that detail, because from my point of view, it felt like it both finished the arc of his early development up through his marriage and first call, but it also was a word of the launch that it was into the deepest places and the hardest work that he was going to be giving himself to.
Man, thank you for saying that. I really appreciate you saying that. I was when I was looking through some of our resources on our website about the King Institute here at Stanford, we have a chronology of important events, and that jumped out at me when I was just reviewing some of our work over the years, and I said, the first sermon that he does as pastor is love your enemies. And I chuckled because I thought, here is this guy who fell in love with the Bible and fell in love with the idea of being a minister, in part because he has this great teacher at Morehouse who preaches that and who teaches that and lectures on this about what does Jesus mean when he says love your enemies. And so here now, and I just thought, as a professor, I bet if he told Professor George Kelsey that was his first sermon, as a professor, there would be nothing probably that would make him smile more, than to think, here this kid who was in my class several years ago is now going on and is. So it was a beautiful moment and a beautiful discovery for me. So thank you for pointing to that.
Lerone, this has been such a rich conversation, and I do think we've covered so many of the elements that the book captures, never adequately in a conversation like this compared to the length and depth of the book. But I think this has given people a really great tasting, and I hope many will read the book. But I also just want to say that as you continue on in the work of leading the King Institute at Stanford, that I will personally be praying for you and for
Thank you.
the work of the Institute and the ongoing urgency of King's voice and impact to only continue to develop and broaden in its and people's understanding of what the whole work was about, because part of it is this comprehensiveness of it. It's the thing that often gets neglected when we peg him as just a, quote, civil rights leader, unquote.
That's right.
He was that, absolutely. But he also had this holistic vision of the world and in that sense, a much bigger vision of God and a much bigger vision of the work to be done. So thank you for leading what you're doing and for taking time today for this conversation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. And can I just add to that? I love the way you said, and I think I would love to close with this, is that King arrives at a theological framework that we could discuss more in depth, but he's attracted to go to Boston University in part because of what you just mentioned about a theological framework that allows him to understand the world and evil in the world and goodness in the world and service. And part of that for King is what is called at the time a theology of personalism. And, the particulars are that basically the highest, the most sacred thing is human personality, right? It's another way of thinking about the Imago Dei, all of us being made in the image of God. And King ends up his formulation is such that he believes that God invites all of us to be co-workers, and that while God's power is infinite, God has chosen to limit God's self in terms of the methods God will use to bring about God's will for the world. And God has chosen, because of the sacredness of humanity, that God has chosen to work with us and to invite us to be co-workers with God to bring about God's will in the world. And part of that for King is going to be, of course, justice, human dignity, and equal opportunity. And I hope that what this book does, and I hope our listeners will recognize that this is a story about how King arrives at that full picture. And hopefully after reading this, that some of our listeners will commit themselves to thinking of the work that they do, whatever profession they're in, as being a co-worker with God to bring about God's will for creation. And so thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be with you. And I'm so thankful we had this conversation.
Thanks so much. Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.